Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian, and thanks for joining us for our weekly cyber report sponsored by Northrop Grumman. Joining us today is Congressman Mike Gallagher, Wisconsin Republican, former Marine, and PhD, who is the co-chair, along with Maine Independent Senator Angus King of the Cyberspace Solarium Commission, the 14-member panel that put together 75 thoughtful recommendations on how to improve the nation's cyber resilience and deterrence capabilities. Sir, thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
I should point out to our audience that you earned your PhD from Georgetown University, and your dissertation was actually on Project Solarium, President Eisenhower's drive to craft a long-range strategy to combat the Soviet Union at a time when these two nuclear powers were squaring off, once having been allies in World War II. One of the key elements of your report was the importance of cyber deterrence. Yet one of the people who is on your group, Dr. Ben Jensen, who's from both Marine Corps University as well as American University, is somebody who's been studying cyber deterrence and what it looks like, and has concluded that actually we don't know enough about that as we should, right? What countries respond and don't respond to. From your standpoint as somebody who has studied deterrence, what does cyber deterrence look like? And how do we need, and what's that line between kinetic and non-kinetic responses?
Well, I think we have to start from a recognition that though we draw inspiration from a lot of time-tested Cold War concepts like deterrence, both deterrence by punishment and deterrence by denial, there's a fundamental difference between strategic nuclear deterrence and what we're calling layered cyber deterrence. If for no other reason that if you think back on the work of the strategists of the time, particularly Bernard Brodie, who in turn influenced Eisenhower, they thought that nuclear deterrence, dealing with what he termed an absolute weapon, was unique in that it could not be allowed to fail. And thus the primary job of the military was to keep the peace, avoid deterrence failures, avoid wars, rather than fighting them. I think we start from a different recognition in cyber, which is to say that deterrence, particularly below the use of force threshold, is constantly failing. Cyber weapons, kind of in an interesting contrast to Brodie's description of an absolute weapon, a nuclear weapon, have been called by David Sanger and others the perfect weapon. Perfect because they offer a degree of anonymity and power to individuals and not just nation states. As we state in the report, one need not be a great power to have a great impact in cyber. So you kind of start from a different point of departure, and that's why we are advocating for a layered approach. In particular, we combine different deterrent mechanisms, extend them beyond the government to develop a whole of nation approach built on three different layers. First, we hope to shape behavior by working with our allies and partners with whom we have shared values, shared collective interest in stable cyberspace, and to promote responsible behavior in cyberspace. But recognizing that norms won't emerge in cyberspace absent U.S. action, recognizing that they can't be created in a laboratory. In the second layer, we really think we need to prioritize in denying the potential benefits to adversaries who have long exploited cyberspace to their advantage and America's disadvantage. And this is a key difference between this form of deterrence and strategic nuclear deterrence, in that we're prioritizing this deterrence by denial as opposed to deterrence by punishment, the threat of massive retaliation. But we do believe in the third layer that we have to be prepared to impose costs against malicious actors. This requires us to maintain the capability, capacity, and credibility to retaliate against actors who target us through cyberspace. So no individual layer alone is sufficient, but we believe that over time, with a more quick and agile federal government working the private sector, we can establish some respectable posture of deterrence.
Do we need a declaratory policy, as some have argued, about when we go kinetic as a dissuasive element of a strategy?
We do. I mean, we believe we have a vague declaratory policy right now for above the use of force threshold that states we retain the right to respond at a time and place of our choosing, or something to that effect. We believe we need to strengthen that a bit to communicate that we will respond while giving the federal government, the military, and civilian cyber actors the freedom of maneuver they need to determine the precise nature of our response. And we also believe that below the use of force threshold, we need to have a clear signaling strategy, constantly signaling to our adversaries and our allies that we are prepared to respond. So, for example, with this cyber attack that occurred on HHS, I think it would make sense for us to not only publicly attribute that attack and name and shame the actor who did it, but find a way to quickly strike back and impose costs on that actor. If it's an individual cyber criminal or just nefarious cyber opportunist, you can imagine a legal response. Attorney General Barr has hinted that that may be in the offing. If it is a nation-state-backed attack, you can imagine us responding in kind with a similar denial of service or imposing sanctions. The point is, we just need to be in the business of constantly communicating to our enemies that they can't get away with this stuff and that there will be clear costs to attacking us, whether below or above the use of force threshold.
In order to get everybody sort of aboard and to understand this, to what degree do you need to scare people, the likes of which actually Harry Truman did, to sort of focus everybody's attention on sort of the magnitude of the threat and the need for response? And to do it in kind of a balanced way, right? I mean, you don't want everybody digging the equivalent of a cyber bunker in their front yard. But what's that balance point? I mean, in order to sort of get everybody's thinking focused on this, because it doesn't work unless everybody sort of understands the nature of the threat and what needs to be done to combat it.
Well, you raise an interesting point, because if you remember, there was sort of Truman 1.0 and Truman 2.0. Truman 1.0 very much attempted to implement a version of containment that was in consonance with how Kennan had articulated the concept in NSC 20-4. But then we had a series of shocks to the system. We had the Soviets detonate a nuclear weapon in 49. We had the invasion of Korea in 50. We had a host of domestic spying cases. And all of a sudden, it seemed the system was blinking red. And so then Truman, who had shelved NSC 68 that NHTSA came up with months before, took it off the shelf and implemented it. So in that case, the American public was woken up by external shocks to the system. What makes this difficult is we've had, I would argue, a series of similar shocks in cyberspace, but because of the unique nature of cyberspace, because it's not as, scary as the Soviets detonating a nuclear weapon, we haven't had that same galvanizing impact on the American public. So part of the report's intent was to wake people up to the nature of the threat. And that's why we wrote it in an unclassified format. That's why we tried to make it accessible to the people that are affected by cyberspace and cyber threats, which is to say everybody.
As my producer was just pointing out, now we're podcasting, right? I mean, when you invoke George Kennan and NSC 68, you're talking, and of course the other giants, NHTSA and others. Last question about how public we need to be. This administration has been incredibly, to some, irresponsible by talking so cavalierly and openly about America's offensive cyber capabilities, and saying that, hey, look, we're in your networks and we're operating. Okay, guard your own house before you taunt a potentially very capable adversary like that. What is the role of us talking publicly about our offensive cyber capabilities, which are in fact second to none on the planet?
Well, let me first remind your listeners that George Kennan was a Wisconsinite. He's from Milwaukee. So I think it's fair to say that Wisconsin won the Cold War single-handedly. So just to throw back on that. Listen, I think it's a balance. I mean, I do
look. You guys have great cheese and great football as well. Great shipyards, right? I mean, I understand it is the horn of not just dairy but industrial plenty out there, and beer. We appreciate all of that.
It's the center of the universe, and everything else is just strategic depth. But I digress. Listen, I think it's a balance, right? I think it's wise to be signaling that we have the ability to impose costs, provided we are actually prepared to impose costs. And I do think and part of what we found during the course of the commission's work is that a lot of what we've done in the last 3 years has been good. Loosening the rules of engagement in cyberspace, which is a combination of National Security Council policy and authorities that Congress granted to NSA and Cybercom in 2 NDAAs ago. That's been good. Moving to this posture of defend forward and persistent engagement. We want to build on that. We want to extend that concept beyond NSA throughout the entire federal government. We think that's a good thing. But ultimately, you have to be able to defend your own networks. And that's why I think some of the least sexy recommendations will end up being the most important. So, for example, we recommend giving DHS's CISA, the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, the authority to conduct persistent threat hunting on all .gov networks in the way that NSA Cybercom can do that on .mil networks, just so that we're getting ahead of the curve. And so I think it's a combination of offense and defense. But so much of what we have to defend is in the private sector, which ultimately leads you back to the idea that we need C-suite executives to step up and prioritize investments in their cybersecurity.
Dr. Gallagher, thanks so much for joining us. It's always a pleasure, and look forward to having you on again to talk about whatever else regarding cyber, but as well as strategy more broadly. Always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, sir.